guy comes up to me. He's like, "Hi, I'm the room dad." I said, "What? What's a room dad?" He's like, "I'm in charge of all the dads socially. We get together once a month. We're going to go over to Christopher's house on Tuesday for ugly sweater night. If you want to wear your ugliest sweater, we're going to talk about being a dad, maybe open up some Diet Cokes." So I told him, I said, "It's nice of you to offer. Can't make it. We're looking at the class," and he points out his son. It's the only Asian kid in the class. He's like, "That's my boy." I'm like, "I know." But again, you got people in this room looking up here going, "You are so close-minded. How dare you? Dare you assume? Don't you think there's other possibilities? Don't you think maybe the Asian father adopted the black child and the black father adopted the Asian child?" I said, "Listen, if I'm putting money on who this Asian kid's going home with, it's this guy, all right? Put $100 on the table. I want to see how PC you get. Where I'm from, these two came in the same car."
Good morning. It's Friday, April the 14th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch, Stuart Varney, the rape of the mind, and Donald Trump. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
Family is a code word for constraint. Families and family values place constraints on individuals more effectively than any other institution, including government. The Christian ethic seeks a society in which all are constrained. They reject big government for failing at constraint and for undermining those institutions like the family that have a chance at succeeding. Tyler Cowen. Big government is as big as self-government is lacking. This axiomatic truth is at the heart of the relationship between the citizen and the state. Mediating institutions, the family having the most leverage of them all, serve as the effective administrators of self-government, sacrifice, cooperation, and constraint. The incentives are aligned. Civilization is a testimony to the relative success of the institution of family in generating constraint and the failure of the state in doing so.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you, thank you. And now, a little bit of positive news from Varney and Company.
Opinion from the prestigious Economist magazine. The lessons, and here's the quote, the lessons from America's astonishing economic record. And the subheadline reads even better. Look at this. Quote, the world's biggest economy is leaving its peers ever further in the dust. Well, they've got an historical review here. Maybe you haven't heard that recently. Here's their reasoning. First, average incomes have grown much faster here than in Western Europe or Japan. The purchasing power of the average family in Mississippi, that's our poorest state, is still higher than in France. Our standard of living remains high, much higher than almost anywhere else, except maybe Norway, that's a petro state, and Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, which are really tiny financial hubs. American companies own more than 20% of all patents registered overseas, more than China and Germany combined. Research and development spending here, way out front of our rivals. In terms of national output, that's GDP, the size of our economy, we now account for 1/4 of the global economy, about the same as in 1990, despite the rise of China. Among rich countries, the so-called G7, America accounts for nearly 60% of output. It was only 40% in 1990. See how far we've come? Big picture, historically, we're doing well, but watch out. The Economist concludes that the more we see our economy as a problem in need of fixing, the more likely politicians are to mess up the next 30 years. That's their words.
And so there's the Stuart Varney show, and Stuart Varney quoting the Economist magazine. He would have done better to provide some more details in terms of which issue, et cetera, so that all these could be considered facts. Right now, they're just considered details, but they're positive details nonetheless. And when you're listening to talk show hosts day after day and hearing nothing but disaster after disaster, like I was talking about Tucker Carlson yesterday, where he's talking about one teacher in Canada that wants to walk around with big fake breasts, and one city in the United States of America that wanted to elect a socialist as mayor, and then try to proclaim that there's some kind of a revolution or a civil war going on. You know, that kind of negative, depression-inducing news. And so now we get something that's positive that basically says, despite all of this stuff that's going on, we're still kicking butt. And we are, as they said, leaving our competition further and further behind. Something to not only think about, but take to heart. And what is it that Sean Hannity always says? Let not your heart be troubled. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now Donald Trump proposes a new civil service test, mandatory civil service test for all federal employees.
Cutting wasteful and job-killing regulations was a key part of my America First economic agenda that built the greatest economy in the history of the world. As I work to quickly save America from Joe Biden's economic disaster, and that's what it is, one of the great economic disasters of all time, I will restore my famously successful executive order requiring that for every one new regulation, 2 old regulations must be eliminated, and I will ask Congress to make it permanent. We will again implement a regulatory budget, putting a hard cap on the cost of regulations to the U.S. economy. Instead of growing the size and scope of the federal government, every single year we've been doing that, we will shrink it every year with aggressive cost reduction targets for each federal department. In addition, we will require that all agencies' regulatory guidance must be posted publicly in a central database or else be rendered null and void, and many of them will in fact be null and void. This will effectively repeal a mountain of stealth regulations and threats that rogue bureaucrats have imposed without proper oversight. And I will sign a law to ban bureaucrats from taking any enforcement action based on informal guidance alone. For example, never again will bureaucrats be allowed to bully and pressure banks to choke off their financially deplatform politically disfavored industries. We're not going to let that happen. Next, I will bring the independent regulatory agencies such as the FCC and the FTC back under presidential authority as the Constitution demands. These agencies do not get to become a fourth branch of government, issuing rules and edicts all by themselves, and that's what they've been doing. I will require that they submit any regulations they're considering for White House review. In addition, we will create an ultra-streamlined federal regulatory framework specifically for freedom cities, allowing them to be true frontiers for the return of U.S. manufacturing, the invention of new industries, the rebirth of economic opportunity, and safe and affordable living. Finally, I will require every federal employee to pass a new civil service test demonstrating an understanding of our constitutional limited government. This will include command of due process rights, equal protection, free speech, religious liberty, federalism, the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. I know all about that at Mar-a-Lago, don't I? And all other constitutional limits on federal power. We will put unelected bureaucrats back in their place, liberate the U.S. economy, and attract millions of jobs and trillions of dollars to our shores. Thank you very much.
And that was Donald Trump, former president, proposing new mandatory civil service tests for all federal employees. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the totalitarian leader from The Rape of the Mind.
The totalitarian leader. The leaders of totalitaria are the strangest men in the state. These men are, like all other men, unique in their mental structure, and consequently, we cannot make any blanket psychiatric diagnosis of the mental illness which motivates their behavior. But we can make some generalizations which will help us towards some understanding of the totalitarian leader. Obviously, for example, he suffers from an overwhelming need to control other human beings and to exert unlimited power. And this, in itself, is a psychological aberration, often rooted in deep-seated feelings of anxiety, humiliation, and inferiority. The ideologies such men propound are only used as tactical and strategical devices through which they hope to reach their final goal of complete domination over other men. This domination may help them compensate for pathological fears and feelings of unworthiness, as we can conclude from the psychological study of some modern dictators. Fortunately, we do not have to rely on a purely hypothetical picture of the psychopathology of the totalitarian dictator. Dr. G.M. Gilbert, who studied some of the leaders of Nazi Germany during the Nuremberg trials, has given us useful insight into their twisted minds. Useful especially because it reveals to us something about the mental interaction between the totalitarian leader and those who want to be led by him. Hitler's suicide made a clinical investigation of his character structure impossible. But Dr. Gilbert heard many eyewitness reports of Hitler's behavior from his friends and collaborators, and these present a fantastic picture of Nazism's prime mover. Hitler was known among his intimates as the carpet eater, because he often threw himself on the floor in a kicking and screaming fit like an epileptic rage. From such reports, Dr. Gilbert was able to deduce something about the roots of the pathological behavior displayed by this morbid genius. Hitler's paranoid hostility against the Jew was partly related to his unresolved parental conflicts. The Jews probably symbolized for him the hatred, drunken father who mistreated Hitler and his mother when the future Führer was still a child. Hitler's obsessive thinking, his furious fanaticism, his insistence on maintaining the purity of Aryan blood, and his ultimate mania to destroy himself and the world were obviously the results of a sick psyche. As early as 1923, nearly 10 years before he seized power, Hitler was convinced that he would one day rule the world, and he spent time designing monuments of victory, eternalizing his glory, to be erected all over the European continent when the day of victory arrived. This delusional preoccupation continued until the end of his life, in the midst of the war he created, which led him to defeat and death. Hitler continued revising and improving his architectural plans. Nazi dictator number 2, Hermann Göring, who committed suicide to escape the hangman, had a different psychological structure. His pathologically aggressive drives were encouraged by the anarchic military tradition of the German Junker classes, to which his family belonged. From early childhood, he had been compulsively and overtly aggressive. He was an autocratic and a corrupt cynic, grasping the Nazi-created opportunity to achieve purely personal gain. His contempt for the common people was unbounded. This was a man who had literally no sense of moral values. Quite different again was Rudolf Hess, the man of passive yet fanatical dog-like devotion, living, as it were, by proxy through the mind of his Führer. His inner mental weakness made it easier for him to live through means of a proxy than through his own personality, and drove him to become the shadow of a seemingly strong man, from whom he could borrow strength. The Nazi ideology gave this frustrated boy the illusion of blood identification with the glorious German race. After his wild flight to England, Hess showed obvious psychotic traits. His delusions of persecution, hysterical attacks, and periods of amnesia are among the well-known clinical symptoms of schizophrenia. Still, another type was Hans Frank, the devil's advocate, the prototype of the overambitious latent homosexual, easily seduced into political adventure, even when this was in conflict with the remnants of his conscience. For unlike Goering, Frank was capable of distinguishing between right and wrong. Dr. Gilbert also tells us something of General Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff, who became the submissive, automatic mouthpiece of the Führer, mixing military honor and personal ambition in the service of his own unimportance. Of a different quality is the SS Colonel Hess, the murderer of millions in the concentration camp of Auschwitz. A pathological character structure is obvious in this case. All his life, Hess had been a lonely, withdrawn, schizoid personality, without any conscience, wallowing in his own hostile and destructive fantasies. Alone and bereft of human attachments, he was intuitively sought out by Himmler for this most savage of all Nazi jobs. He was a useful instrument for the committing of the most bestial deeds. Unfortunately, we have no clear psychiatric picture yet of the Russian dictator Stalin. There have been several reports that during the last years of his life, he had a tremendous persecution phobia and lived in constant terror that he would become the victim of his own purges. Psychological analysis of these men shows clearly that a pathological culture, a mad world, can be built by certain impressive psychoneurotic types. The venial political figures need not even comprehend the social and political consequences of their behavior. They are compelled not by ideological belief, no matter how much they may rationalize to convince themselves they are, but by distortions of their own personalities. They're not motivated by their advertised urge to serve their country or mankind, but rather by an overwhelming need and compulsion to satisfy the cravings of their own pathological character structures. The ideologies they spout are not real goals. They are the cynical devices by which these sick men hope to achieve some personal sense of worth and power. Subtle inner lies seduce them into going from bad to worse. Defensive self-deception, arrested insight, evasion of emotional identification with others, degradation of empathy. The mind has many defense mechanisms with which to blind the conscience. A clear example of this can be seen in the way the Nazi leaders defended themselves through continuous self-justification and exculpation when they were brought before the bar at the Nuremberg trials. These murderers were aggrieved and hurt by the accusations brought against them. They were the very picture of injured innocence. Any form of leadership, if unchecked by controls, may gradually turn into dictatorship. Being a leader, carrying great power and responsibility for other people's lives, is a monumental test for the human psyche. The weak leader is the man who cannot meet it, who simply abdicates his responsibility. The dictator is the man who replaces the existing standards of justice and morality by more and more private prestige, by more and more power, and eventually isolates himself more and more from the rest of humanity. His suspicion grows, his isolation grows, and the vicious circle leading to a paranoid attitude begins to develop. The dictator is not only a sick man, he is also a cruel opportunist. He sees no value in any other person and feels no gratitude for any help he may have received. He is suspicious and dishonest and believes that his personal ends justify any means he may have to achieve them. Peculiarly enough, every tyrant still searches for some self-justification. Without such a soothing device for his own conscience, he cannot live. His attitude toward the dictator can never become a mature person. But whether he acknowledges them or not, he has internal conflicts. He suffers somewhere from internal confusion. These inner weaknesses he tries to repress sternly. If they were to come to the surface, they might interfere with the achievement of his goals. Yet, in the attacks of a rage, his weakening strength is evident. It is because the dictator is afraid, albeit unconsciously, of his own internal contradictions, that he is afraid of the same internal contradictions of his fellow men. He must purge and purge, terrorize and terrorize in order to still his own raging inner drives. He must kill every doubter, destroy every person who makes a mistake, imprison everyone who cannot be proved to be utterly single-minded. In totalitaria, the latent aggression and savagery in man are cultivated by the dictator to such a degree that they can explode into the mass criminal actions shown by Hitler's persecution of minorities. Ultimately, the country shows a real pathology, an utter dominance of destructive and self-destructive tendencies.
And that was the totalitarian leader from The Rape of the Mind by Joost-meerlo, MD, back in
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple
This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. So I'm reminding you that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.